You guys absolutely loved this dress, and one of the comments I was getting quite frequently was about the pattern matching that I did at the centre front waist and also down the centre back. Now, I'm definitely no expert, but I made a second version of this dress out of the same fabric to test the pattern tweaks that I've made, and whilst I was making that, I filmed my tips and tricks for pattern matching. Now, I'm not saying this is the best way, I'm not saying this is the only way, but this is the way that works best for me to make sure that I am matching up patterns across stitching lines, not just seam lines. Ask me how I know. Let me show you how I do it. Okay, so the very first thing that I considered was that it was probably going to be more waist whittling if I put the darker print around the waist. So this is my front piece. I have basically just put it up as high as I can possibly get it, because this is where I've cut a previous piece out, obviously, making sure that the waist on both sides is going through the dark part of the print. So I'm going to get this cut out, then I can work out where I need to put my skirt centre front so that it matches up with this flower. Okay, so believe it or not, this is actually my bodice, and what I've done is I have pinned it to the fabric so that the pattern is completely matching up. And the next thing I'm going to do is draw along this line here, the very bottom line of my bodice. Now you have to remember that the stitching line is 5/8, because I'm using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The stitching line is actually 5/8 of an inch up from here, so this is kind of just a guideline so that I can then put the pattern in the right place so that the stitching line of the skirt matches up with the stitching line of the bodice, so that when I put the two of them together, the pattern should match up along the stitching line, not this cut edge, because that is something that's very important to remember. I'm using a friction pen. I've double checked and it does come away from this fabric with heat without leaving a white residue. So if I remove my bodice, you can see I have my line here. Now, like I say, this is the cut edge. The seam allowance that I want to sew to is here, so I'm going to need to put my seam allowance of my skirt up here, which will be 1.25 inches away from this line, or 5/8 of an inch away from the stitching line. Personally, I'm going to make a line 1.25 inches up, because I know that 2 seam allowances of 5/8 of an inch totals 1.25. But if you want to make doubly sure, you can draw in your stitching line of your bodice now, and then you can draw in the stitching line on your skirt and match that up, and then cut it out with the actual stitching lines being the pieces that match. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I've drawn in both lines for you to illustrate the point. So this is the bottom edge of the bodice, this is the stitching line, so 5/8 of an inch, that's the bodice seam allowance. So when I put the skirt on, this will be the stitching line of the skirt, so I need my seam allowance of my skirt to be up here, so that when I stitch the bodice and the skirt together, this is the stitching line and this is the piece that will match. So I'm going to go and get my skirt pattern piece and pin it with the top edge, the cut edge of my pattern piece, level with this line here, which is 1.25 inches away from the bottom of the bodice, and then this is the stitching line, so 5/8 of an inch up from that. And here we are with the pattern piece on there, so hopefully you can see that I've got the top edge of my pattern piece meeting up with that line that is 1.25 inches away from the bottom of my bodice. So technically, when I sew these together, they should match up pretty nicely and give me a fairly seamless centre front pattern continuation that should be pleasing to the eye. That's the theory. So I put no special effort into getting this pattern to match up across the centre front. I literally just pinned the darts so that they matched and sewed it into place, hoping for the best. And this is the result. If I'd been working with stripes, I definitely would have pinned individual stripes, possibly even have hand basted it into place. But with this floral pattern being as large as it is, I just winged it, and this is how it came out. And it's all thanks to the prep work that I did at the beginning when I was cutting the pattern out. So the important thing to remember is that you're matching up the stitching lines, not the cut edge. You need to make sure that you are taking into account whatever seam allowance you have on your pattern. As you've seen, for my one it was 5/8 of an inch, you could have 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch, you could have an inch. As long as you make sure that you are taking into account that you're matching the stitching line, not the actual cut lines, this method should work really well for you. I will say again, please double check if you use friction pens that they will come off of the fabric that you're using without leaving a white residue. Double check that on a spare piece of fabric before you start drawing all over the front of your bodice, skirt, whatever whatever. So obviously I've shown you this on a horizontal seam, but this method works exactly the same for a vertical seam, so down the centre back for over a zip. Again, you may wish to baste things into place if you are a little bit worried, but I found with prints like the one that I used for this dress, it works out pretty well for me, just sewing carefully along the stitching line of your pattern. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this tip here.